Today is a bit of a special episode. I am joined by my good friend and client, Kylie Ota, a repeat guest on the podcast. I'll have to link to her earlier episodes from this year because they were golden as well. But she recently experienced a very major loss, and I had an interesting experience with a loss from 6 years ago recently. And being the burnout coach expert that she is, and of course, me and my money expertise, we decided to have a conversation about money and grief and burnout. And essentially, you get to listen in as we kind of chat through some of these things that are so important and so vital. This is my disclaimer that we are talking about grief. We are talking about, loss, um, death, and those things. So I would love for you to take a listen. And I think this is a very important topic, but I want you to be able to make the decision to listen to it as well. So, without further ado, let's get to it.
Oh my gosh. Like when I texted you, did I text you or you texted me? But
I texted you because I was in the car and like all of a sudden I was just having all of these like podcast ideas. So I was like writing them down and I was like, we should talk about grief and money. And this is probably how I'm going to start the podcast. We finally figured it out. We're just going to go with it.
yeah, yeah.
So,
And but right when you sent it to me, I was in that mode where like I was thinking about all of the things that I wanted to spend, right? We've talked before, on like the coaching calls, like, oh, these dopamine purchases. And I was in like this dopamine fallout, I'll call it, where I'm like I'm hurting, like I'm so used to buying things when I'm in pain. Whether it's, I watch too much Clean Talk and I want to go to Amazon and I want to buy something that's going to make me feel better about my house because I'm so overwhelmed and my house is like, oh, well, maybe if I got some, cubes for my calyx over there, yeah, that will help. So I don't have to see the visual clutter, not having to deal with the clutter, but I'll just shove it in a box and it'll look pretty and I don't have to be visually, I would say stimulated, but
yeah,
visually,
present to it.
yeah. Yeah. And there's so many times where I want to buy something. And my husband would be like, do you really need that? And ever since we came up with the term dopamine purchase, he was like, uh-huh. Is that another dopamine purchase? And I'm like, "Ugh." Like he'll catch me on those things. But I'm like, hey, you have some dopamine activities that you like to do. So like golfing, like, geez, like that's a lot. Well, I have a gym membership, so well, that's a lot too. So
It's like multi-purpose, right? I love that y'all call each other out on it. Like that. I love hearing that. That always it's fun. But
yeah,
there's also like that, I guess before we go further, a little backstory for those that are listening. Why don't you share a little bit that you feel comfortable with about like the loss that you just experienced and why this is
yeah,
so timely, prevalent?
yeah. So I just recently lost my best friend of 40 years. I'm aging myself, and she just turned 45. I'll be 45 at the end of this year, and she had endometrial carcinoma, which is a cancer that started in the endometrial area. And by the time that they caught it this past March, she was just having some pain. And I know some women listening, like, oh, like I get pains every month, but her pain just didn't go away. So she just decided to take care of it. And when she went in, there was a tumor the size of an avocado. And right, so they did a biopsy and it was malignant. And right, all the protocols, they scanned her. It had metastasized to her lungs.
Mm.
So from March, and then right now, at the time of this recording, it is September. She just passed a week ago. And yeah, it just by the time they found it, it was stage 4 and it's type 3, the aggressive type. And it just took over her body. And the amazing thing is, well, she's my best friend. If you don't know a whole lot about me, right? I love planning. I used to be a launch manager, and so like she and I are very similar in that way. So she had all of her end of life things planned out, and I'm also part of that process now, but that's the kind of the gift of having cancer instead of it being a car accident or something that, you leave this world abruptly. She was able to call us in and talk to us, and I was able to process a lot of the grief up front because I knew she was passing. And even when um, I went back home in August to see our final goodbyes because that's what she said. They told her the cancer was spreading even more rapidly, and she only had a little bit of time left. So she wanted to say goodbye while she was still coherent because the tumors had kind of shifted and moved up to her brain, her lymph nodes, like it was just starting to go everywhere. And I was able to do that. And then this past week or whatever, I had a urge to kind of ask the husband, like, how is she doing? And it just so happened she had a end of life meeting that day because they told her she didn't really have that much more time to go. And I decided to just jump on a plane. I'm from Hawaii, so I jumped from here in LA. Flew back home to Hawaii. I got to see her for her last 3 days here on this earth, and I was able to process my grief with her because, you know, um, we knew that she was at the end. And it's weird how God kind of, in each instance, there was an urge to talk to her or reach out to her. And that's also part of my grieving process is, okay, I got to be more in touch with God and listening to the unctions of the Holy Spirit, where it's like, okay, God, you are here, you are present. And that made it like 1,000 times easier to process the grief because I knew that God was with me. He was preparing me for the loss. Even like words that I was getting, like people that I follow online, I was just getting these words about transition. And I mean, I'm transitioning in my business and in like my ministry, like a lot of things are shifting there. So it applied there, but I was like, how appropriate that there's this heavenly transition that just happened. And so, anyway, all through that, God had been preparing me for the grief. So, the grief for me has come in waves. Like when I hear a popular song that we used to sing to, we grew up in the 80s. So, so, 80s music will pop on. I'm like, oh, oh. And then it'll just remind me when we had these good memories, but it's been a blessing to have those memories.
Yeah.
Um, but when we're talking about the money and the grief, there's so many people who I've experienced this with other passings where money is like people fight over money, end of life. It's like the body's not even in the ground and they're having these conflicts about okay, who gets the inheritance, who gets the car, who gets the this and oh my gosh, that's like the worst. So that's I don't know, that's my little backstory about grief and money.
And I'm glad you brought that up about like the inheritance piece and that part because there's like with my grandmother, my maternal grandmother passing, there wasn't even really necessarily like about the money originally, but then it kind of became about the money and there was like people were hurt and they talk I don't remember who we were speaking with. Maybe it was like a funeral director and they talk about like this is like where that happens all the time because emotions are so high when you're processing grief like that.
Yeah, yeah. And there are different ways to process grief as well. Like
Yeah.
each person does it differently. Well, And like, well, you know me, I had to bring my archetypes into it. And I just did a post yesterday about it, right? You have the people who handle things differently, like the perfectionist, which is like my friend, right? She planned her end of life things and like keeping yourself busy and doing, like doing those things is one way that people manage grief, you know?
Mhm.
And then there are other people who are, like I called her, what did I call her? The hippie, the spiritual hippie. Because right, there are people who kind of what I shared earlier, right? I'm really okay with her passing because I believe in the afterlife and
Right.
she's in a better place and right, she's not in pain anymore. Like when she was in her last days, they were ma managing her respiratory and because it had gone into her lungs were at 50% capacity. So as she was starting to struggle with her breathing, that's what I think kind of took her life. I mean, there's an autopsy and whatever that's been done, but she was just having a really hard time breathing. And I was actually happy when she passed because of the circumstances and because I understand that there is an afterlife and I'll get to see her in heaven. And I told her, I said, hey, make sure you save that mansion next to yours for me. And our kids can play in the backyard together again because our kids are about the same age as well. Like our kids and our grandkids could play together. So like that's my belief and that's what helped me to process the grief. So, just people deal with grief differently. And even like with money, like some people will want to just go out and spend money. Like they see like, okay, it's the end of life. Like, oh gosh, life is too short. We gotta go and live big. And then they start spending all this money because they feel like life is too short or, like they're hit with this, like, life is too short. I need to just do it all now and do it all big. And then they go on this spending spree, not realizing that, hey, like you're still here, you still need to have enough money to live until like who knows when you'll live until.
Yeah.
It could be 80, it could be 100. I mean, and it could be tomorrow. You never know when you're gonna go. But like those are those people who are a little bit myopic, like, oh, life is short. Like, what if my life ends tomorrow, right? And then they start spending money. And then there's the other people who start to hoard because
Life is too short, right?
life is too
It's
short.
the same
So
thought.
yeah, but just how they're looking at things and
Mhm.
yeah, so yeah,
I feel like it's
grief.
everything within moderation. Like there are times like to give yourself grace and like yes, we can spend money. And especially if like you have the system set up that like we talk about and the things that like we've worked on as we've worked together. If you have those things in place, you know where certainly the boundary, but that's like the best word that comes to mind. Like where the boundary is that you can let yourself spend and it's not
Yeah,
um over what you can afford. And it's same on the other side. Like if you are like, okay, shutting down and you're not really living life anymore because life is so short and we feel like we have to save and hold on to everything, you still have those systems in place showing you where you do need to spend money and you do need to
yeah,
enjoy the life and like everything like in grace and having the tools in place, like whether you're working with a coach or you've got the system. I mean, I think you and I both agree it's always better when you're working with a coach because you have that
yes,
person to bounce off of and be like, okay, this is
yeah,
what I'm feeling. Like, is this realistic? Like, if
yeah,
it's the purchase you're making, like, is it a realistic purchase that I should make, or should I like hold out? Is this something that, like, making sure you're not going to the extreme, but also giving
yeah,
yourself the space to heal and process things. And I know I think I shared briefly with you. So if you watch Virgin River, this is a spoiler alert, okay? Um when we were out of town on vacation, I was watching the latest season of Virgin River. What is the season 5? And it has been, see, Brooklyn's 5, so 2017, 6 years, a little over 6 years since I had my miscarriage. But the main character goes through a miscarriage. And even though all this time had passed, there was a scene, and it wasn't even like the actual miscarriage. Like I was sad because, you're involved with the character story, right? And like you're sad for
Yeah.
that. But after she was waiting to go in for the DNC, and they're sitting in the truck outside, and she's like, I don't want to go in yet. Cause like this is the hardest
Mm.
part. See if I can do this without crying. Cause it caught me so off guard how much I felt it, because you go into the waiting room and everyone else in there is there to check up on their baby, and you're not, because you lost your baby. And that was the exact same thing that I had experienced when I had to go in for my post post loss, I guess you would call it, sonogram, to
Mm.
make sure like everything had passed. I chose not to do the DNC, so we had to do the sonogram
Mm.
to make sure everything was back to normal. And there was
Got it.
three other families in there. One of them was doing the gender reveal. Like I can still remember everything, and they're
Yeah.
all there to check on your baby, and you're sitting there
Yeah.
by yourself alone. And I just lost it. It was like in hysterical tears. My husband was there, thankfully. So it was like I had somebody to comfort me, but I was totally caught off guard by how much, like how real it felt, like how recent it
Yeah.
felt all over again.
Yeah.
And so it's not always a matter of like this just happened. Like you talked about, it comes in waves. And apparently, like, the time doesn't necessarily matter. And, time heals all wounds, but some of them are still there. So even if it's not a recent loss, this is
Yeah.
still applicable.
Yeah. I was just talking to a client yesterday because she's like, I don't know why I'm crying right now because I'm happy. And I said, you know what? Those are probably old tears. You know, like some part of you is either grieving or processing. Um, we're talking about an old relationship that she was in.
Mm.
And she's like, why am I crying? And, they're just layers that are unprocessed. So, it's like it's okay. So, if you're listening to either my story or Amy's story, you have your own grief story and like tears are starting to come and you're like, but I thought I processed it already. Just be okay that this is old tears.
Yeah.
It's not like it's not something, oh, I thought I had passed and whatever, it's like, no, new thoughts will come up. And like I said, when I was listening, like an 80s jam came on at the gym, and I was like, about to lose it. Because I had just, when we drive long distances, I turn on this Spotify playlist and it's 80s because my husband and I grew up in the 80s. And yeah, and that was one of the last texts that I sent her where she was still texting back and forth. I screenshot. I was like, "Hey, thinking of you," because we used to sing it all the time when we were growing up. And I karaoke, it's like thinking of you. Psh. And it's like, whew. Like you said, it comes in waves. And not that I would be, embarrassed to cry at my gym because it's a super comfortable place for me. I'm there pretty much every day. Like I have so many friends there. Um, but I just didn't feel like releasing them at the time. So,
Mhm.
you can choose when you release your emotions, but you know, you do need to. You
Yeah.
have to release them somehow, some way, or they will manifest in a different part of your life or different part of your body. For me, I'm a burnout coach, so I had burnout, but when I was looking back at the precursors and really trying to understand burnout, because I was under the impression like, oh, it was just because I was a shift worker for so many years and my body was burnt out. And it's like, no, wait, there are other aspects of burnout. Like there's the mental capacity, there's the emotional capacity. Like I was depleted in a whole lot of those areas and not necessarily in that part of my life because I got remarried and everything was good, but I wasn't taking into account the emotional damage that I had acquired in a previous relationship. And
Mhm.
I was like, oh my goodness. So these scars, emotional scars were also part of why I was feeling so burnt out. and why my body was reacting in a certain way and causing the cortisol, the adrenals, and all of that to kind of implode on itself. And it's like, oh, okay. Because I'm like, I'm sleeping okay, but my cortisol was still having a hard time resetting. And I was like, oh, it's deeper. The more I started to do more work on myself, and I went down the rabbit hole of healing, and I'm still down on that rabbit hole.
The never
But
ending rabbit hole, right? Like that's what we
yeah,
continue to do. And it's like, okay, even though we know like that we don't arrive, it's kind of like, I thought we had that figured out by now. And then it's like this whole new layer that like we get to work on and we're
yeah,
still working on it ourselves. I think that's what allows us to help our clients so much as well. Like, because we see, like, we're on this journey too. It's not like this whole we've arrived, I'm on this pedestal thing. Like, no,
right.
like this stuff sucks. Like,
Right. Like your post, was it today or yesterday, where you're like, hey, I went over budget.
today, I
And
guess, like we're over budget. 8 categories for those the behind the scenes. Like my budget app is like, you were over budget in 8 categories right now. And I'm like, okay, like that's it is what it is. And we're
yeah,
moving forward. And it's not, it doesn't define me. And
yeah,
just where you're at now, like going through like these grief process is even if you are in like a really high wave, like that it doesn't define you. And I think
yeah,
working to know like it's gonna be okay, even if it doesn't feel okay in the moment is really important.
yeah, yeah. And yeah, even like just how we process in and when it's the emotional piece, the mental piece, when we're dealing with the money too, like we've talked a lot about emotional spending.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the biggest thing around grief and money is where we have to be cognizant of what emotion we're in at the moment. Because you could be in an elated moment and you're like, oh my gosh, or like it's a memory, like, oh, I should buy this because this reminds me of her. And of course, it's worth it because I want to remember her. There's so many like, little holes that can just kind of erode at your money, and like, there's so many like random purchases that come with grief as well. I mean, or just in the death process, right? You have to buy caskets, you have to buy and if you don't have life insurance to cover those things, like where are you going to pull it from? I mean, right, she was young. She wasn't anticipating dying at the age of 45, but she was covered by life insurance and this is only a God thing. She was in the military. But she's in the National Guard, but she was on active duty orders. So because she was on orders, the
Mm-hmm.
military paid for all of the hospital things, and she got connected to the Wounded Warrior Project, and they covered everything that wasn't covered by the hospital. So she was kind of in and out of the hospital towards the end, you know. So when she would come home, they got her an oxygen machine, like, and it was all covered
Wow.
by the Wounded Warrior Project and like the hospice nurses and whatever. I don't know which part covered it all, but
Mhm.
between the two, between TRICARE and Wounded Warrior, like, the family doesn't have to pay a dime.
Yeah.
So it's just, I know that's more of the right a defense.
Yes.
So, right, but having a lot of times as entrepreneurs, we focus on offense, 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 like making more money, making more money. But if you added up all of her, like, there's no way they would have had made enough money. And you probably know a lot of people who are in medical debt, right? There's student loan debt that is enormous, and people are trying to get out from under that. Or there are like business debt, like that I have, and you and I work through, but business debt that we're trying to pay off, and we feel like we can't get through them sometimes. And then there's medical debt. Oh, you have a story about medical debt. I forgot that
I
one.
have several stories about medical debt, but yes, we do. But, background being in insurance, like the life insurance conversation is one that we would have like all the time. And I don't, It's like the curse of insurance. You might have heard of the curse of coaching, like where you know too much. Okay, the curse of insurance, you never feel like you have enough insurance. Okay, so it's been like this skill that I've worked at for the past, I don't know how long have I been out now. Like it's okay, we don't need as much, but
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many conversations we would have about like, okay, this needs to be in place. It doesn't matter. Like there's not a too young for insurance. And actually, this is actually bad. I really meant to do it on all of them, but William's the only one that has it. But
Mm.
my boss, his daughter was diagnosed neuroblastoma, I think is what it was, a form of cancer at like 6 months old.
Oh, wow.
So because State Farm is who I worked with, they have a really great policy. It's called a 20 pay policy. So it's a whole life policy. And when you take it out on a child, you can do, what's the name of the rider? There's a rider that's like, I don't know, cents on the dollar that you can add on that at certain major milestones in their life. I want to say it's like 18, 30, like
Mm.
it's specific numbers. You can purchase more life insurance like automatically. There's no medical renewal needed. But because he had purchased that policy and added that on there, she now has life insurance. Now, thankfully, like the cancer is gone and she's been cancer free, but it's much harder to get that insurance now. Most places wouldn't
Right.
even write you having cancer in the past, where it was something that they took care of before. And then you've got like the stay-at-home mom. Well, if you're staying at home mom, they're not bringing any income in. Well, you might be like, I have my side business. I'm not bringing any like major income in. I'm just staying home. Like, I don't need life insurance. Like, well, what happens if you're gone? Like, who takes
Right.
care of the kids? We used to always talk to the guys. It was like, do you want your wife to have to get remarried right away? Like, if you're gone, like, no, we need to be properly insured and like having conversations. And this is something like I geek out about, obviously. So if you're wondering, like, I love talking about this, like, just send me a message if you have enough insurance because it's so important and it makes such a difference. And that is one
Yeah.
of the things like that has the fighting that happens over money. Like when you take care of the money, that
Yeah.
doesn't happen. There was
Yep.
a study done, oh, it was probably 6, 7 years ago, that like 90% of people are counting on winning the lottery, an inheritance, or a lawsuit to be able to retire. So like I need to screenshot your face there. It was really funny. So like we're counting on like somebody screwing up, winning the lottery, or somebody dying like with enough money. And that I think causes so many of the arguments. And if we have the money thing figured out
Yeah.
and whatever you might get from an inheritance is just bonus, it's not going to cause all of those fights.
Right. Right. And like and different types of money are subject to different taxes.
Right.
So that's what you have to understand as well. Like I'm not a tax professional, like none of us are. We're not
Right.
financial professionals, but I work with one
Mm-hmm.
and he explained the difference. Okay, you can take money from here because right when I moved from full-time employment to full-time entrepreneurship, I was like, "Hmm, you know, there's a dip in income that happens. Let's just be honest, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so we went over some of the money options that I had. And he was like, "Well, you could do this, you could do that, but you shouldn't like touch this because da, da, da." And when you're talking about insurance, right? We had a whole life policy, so I was able to pull from the what is like is it
The
cash
dividends.
reserves,
Yeah, the cash.
dividends?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I was like, "Oh, like I didn't know that that was a thing." I'm just like, "Here, take my money because I need to put it somewhere."
Mm-hmm.
And I
And
wanted,
people talk so poorly about whole life insurance, but I have to tell you, if you look at like my investment portfolio, my whole life insurance is performing a lot better, a lot more consistent than like my stock market investments right now. Just saying, like, and it's there and you have it, and like, just it's
yeah,
not necessarily all bad. And then there's
right.
also, I don't even know if you know this or not, there's a module in the academy that talks about like how to protect some of these things because of course I'm not a financial advisor, but
Right.
there's some things that you can put in place that's like, hey, making sure things bypass probate so that your loved ones do get the money and it doesn't have to be necessarily all tax. And even like there's stuff with houses and we have some things that are set up to be willed one way in the family, and it does not make sense from a tax perspective at all. But, it's not my place. But you have to ask these questions like, okay, is this the best thing to do, or are there better options to be able to
Right.
make sure, if you want your loved ones to be able to truly have something, set it up in a way that they'll actually get something, not that they'll have to fight.
Oh, that's the worst, right? When things end up in probate and you get like half of what you're supposed to get.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, hurts my heart. Yeah. And I've been on that end, right? Like some of my older family members who have passed. So, case in point, right? My great grandmother had a funeral plan, but it was so outdated. It didn't cover anything by the time she died. She was 96 years old when she died.
Oh
Oh,
my goodness.
so um no, total transparency. I was going through a divorce at the time, so I had taken money. I took out a loan on my 401k to pay for the lawyers, and I had some extra. So I used the extra because you can't pay it back. You either have to pay it back in full or you have to keep making your installments,
Right.
right? And I was like, well, I just got this cash sitting around, and I paid for the burial fees and things like, the things that you don't think about when people
Mm-hmm.
die. And everyone was like, "Oh my gosh," because I'm the great grandchild, okay? I'm the oldest great grandchild, so we'll just put it that way. And I was, gosh, oh my gosh. You and I were talking about this the other day. I think I was not even 30 years old yet, but I had my two children. Like my second
Mm-hmm.
was born when I was 22, and I had a townhouse, and like I was pretty, I would say financially mature for my age because I was
Yeah.
around a lot of people who had more financial maturity. So I learned about money from a young age, right? When I got hired into my company, I was 20 years old, and then I was around all of these retired or soon to be retirees that were like, max out your 401k, do this, do that, like telling me about all those blind sides that I wouldn't have known about as a 20-year-old kid,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And my ex-husband was also in insurance before we met. So he was telling me about the Rule of 72 and like I got a lot of financial education from him. So like, there's always a silver lining in
Yes.
everything, right? But just understanding how money works can just reduce your stress, especially when you're dealing with end of life things. Can you imagine, right? My friend's husband having like, okay, we'll deal with this now, but okay, I know I'm going to be having insurmountable debt for the rest of my life because my wife had cancer.
Yeah.
That's a lot of pressure. And I'm sure that probably would have put a lot of pressure on my friend had she not had access to like whatever she wanted as far as treatment goes, you know, like having to nickel and dime, like, oh, should I
Mhm.
choose this treatment or that treatment? Like, which one can I actually afford?
Yeah.
Like, oh, it's just so many decisions that we have to make around money. And when you have that peace of mind that you're covered, like when you go through the money checklist, like especially the end of month checklist that I need to get on, be better about. But like understanding where your money is going, what you're spending it on, and how much you have in reserves, how much you have in, for fun money, or blow money, right? Like just having those buckets just really make you feel so supported, and you can make your decisions a lot easier that way. You're not going to have decision fatigue. You're not going to be like, how much does Peter get? How much does Paul get? Okay, Paul, how much do you have to pay back to Peter? And Peter, how much are you going to have to pay back to Paul? And just swooshing your money around because you can't make ends meet, which like some people may be dealing with right now, or
Yeah.
especially in that time of grief or loss. Because right? When you were going through your loss of the miscarriage, right? There were medical bills that were involved. And then it's like, okay, yeah, I'm dealing with all of this now. And that's also part of the grief, right? knowing that you had the loss, but yet seeing this bill come every month to pay off this thing, it's like that's another trigger that you
Yeah.
can avoid too. Yeah, like yeah, I found a Christmas card as a bookmark in a book I was reading yesterday from my friend who passed. So it's like the triggers will come out of the blue. You never know when they're gonna hit. So, right, you can control the amount of triggers that you have by having your money in place. And not to say that you need to have this in place. It's just we're just trying to help you alleviate the
Yeah.
amount of triggers that you're exposed to so that your nervous system doesn't have to process each and every one of them, especially when you're like grief plus money or debt. It's like
And just being prepared so when that you are triggered, you can handle it and not go into that burnout or overwhelm, wherever that extreme reaction would be for you, and just being
right.
able to use the word regulate. I think that's the word that
Yeah.
we were talking about last week. Yes.
Yeah.
So just being able to regulate when they do come up.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Okay. So this was awesome because I knew it would be.
I
Okay.
know we touched everything.
I think we did. We did good. For anybody that wants to connect with you, why don't you share how to connect with you? Because this is going on both of our podcasts. So we're both
Yeah.
going to sign off here.
Yeah. So again, my name is Kylie Ota. I am your burnout coach for entrepreneurs. You can catch me at my website, of course, kylieota.com. It's KYLIEOTA.com. And I also have a podcast, The Burnt Out Entrepreneur. You can catch me on Spotify, Apple, wherever you listen to podcasts. And yeah, I also have a burnout archetype quiz, which is what I was referring to earlier. There are 4 different personality types that I take you through. And so you take the quiz, you get a readout of what your personality type is and how to deal with burnout according to your archetype. Because even with money, even with grief, like Aimee was on my podcast, we talked about money and archetypes. And each person deals with money differently. Each person deals with grief differently. Each person deals with burnout differently. So it's not a one size fits all. Just like with Aimee's program, there's not a one size fits all. There is a specific protocol, but like according to your personality type, like how do you like to do things? Like maybe you need to have a different like amount of money in your blow money fund because you are like spontaneous and you want to go on trips and you want to do those things, but you can have those things if you need them. So anyway, it's called burnoutarchetypequiz.com. You can go get your personality type and just see how it relates to your journey in entrepreneurship and how to protect yourself from burnout according to your personality type. Yeah.
Okay. And of course, my name is Aimee Cerka. I am the money confidence coach for the female entrepreneur who's looking to make money simple. And you can catch me on my website, aimeecerka.com, has all the resources, but I love to hang out on Instagram at Aimee Cerka, AIMEECERKA. And of course, I have my podcast as well. It's called Your Money, Your Life. Brand new Unlock Your Cash Flow Calculator, which isn't even available online yet. So if you want to check that out, it's 12 simple questions to help you figure out what you need to tweak to truly unlock your cash flow potential as an entrepreneur. Just send me a message on Instagram that says calculator and I will get that to you. I think that's it for now. We'll see you next time, guys.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much for listening to the Your Money, Your Life podcast. Wondering what's next? When you're ready, there are different levels of support that you can use on the path to creating unstoppable finances and your unstoppable life. After all, your finances are unique and your support should be too. Ultimately, we'll create a customized plan to ditch financial struggle for good that works for you, your goals, your priorities, your life. Go to workwithaimee.com to get started with one of our most popular programs, or you can book a Q&A call with me and we'll figure out what your next step should be.